Miigwech. Thank you so much. I didn't realize that Jim and I got confused so often. It's probably the swanky jacket. That's flannel. Miigwech apiji and inimiguan bajayan, weweni de nanaga de wendamang, dewajge ijichigayang, weweni sanada, denisrotadiang. Wagosh, indigu, megazi and do dame, anyway, wasawa de shkonigan, wenja bayan, gazaga squaji mekag, minawa in G kingdom, apiji, wabandiyang. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. We got a full house. It fills me up to know that so many people care about truth, reconciliation, justice, and healing. We don't get to healed by skipping all the healing. We don't get to reconciled by skipping all the reconciling. We have to do the things. Here we are, trying to figure it out. How do we do the things? My native name is Wagosh, that means fox. I come from the Eagle clan and from Leech Lake. So I'm really excited for the conversation that we'll get to have tonight. In fact, there's no way to complete a conversation. I think maybe in the Western world we're conditioned to a nice linear pathway with a bow tied on the end, but accepting and expecting that we're not going to get everything wrapped up in one good event is part of the process. I'm not going to belabor what is going wrong. There's plenty. Here's a picture of one of my sons. He actually lives in the Twin Cities Metro, and he works on a union construction crew. He's been told he has to bring a passport to work. I mean, he's an enrolled member of a tribe, and his boss isn't trying to be mean. He's trying to make sure he doesn't have a tough day. There are lots of white folk who work on his crew, too, and they do not need to bring a passport. And so it's clear that the racial fault lines are intersecting with all of the xenophobia. It's just tough out there. It doesn't just go away because we want it to go away. We're going to have to figure out how to do the things to move above and beyond. So you've been watching the news. Y'all know what's up. There are things we can do, you know, at a time when there are 10,000 books banned in American schools. Minnesota passed legislation to prohibit book bans across the state. We're a purple state, not just because of Prince or the Vikings. And even in this mixed company, we're finding ways to do the right things. Who would like to live a long time? I'm seeing some hands up. That's encouraging. If anyone didn't have their hand up, we do have some school counselors and people in the professions who are happy to support. In my work, I kind of sit on a three-legged stool. One of the legs is just community service and ceremony work. I officiate at naming ceremonies, traditional Ojibwe funerals, and everything in between. That's all uncompensated and just in the traditions of our people. Spend about a third of my time doing my actual job, which is professor of Ojibwe, meaning I teach Ojibwe language, history, culture. And I spend about a third of my time writing books, giving talks on diversity, equity, inclusion, tribal sovereignty, language revitalization, and things like that. They're like three strands of a braid. They all intersect with one another. But I'm also trained as a historian, and I've done a lot of historical research, and I've been kind of amazed looking at Native communities at how many people had a remarkably long life. I got to spend a lot of time with the late Archie Mosé, who was born in 1901. He passed away in 1996. Not only was he born in a wigwam, even his children were born in wigwams. He was 12 years old the first time he met a white man. That was an American experience, just not one you often hear about. He was in his 30s first time he saw a car. When I met him, he was in a little modern house watching WWF SmackDown on a TV and laughing really loud. So inspiring to think about how did he get there. And it wasn't just his longevity. He was surrounded by children and grandchildren and a community. In our language, the word for an elder, gichiaya'a, literally means a great being. The word for an elderly woman, mindumuye, means one who holds things together and describes the role of the family matriarch. Age, highly respected in Native communities. And he had a good friend from the neighboring tribe who was Ho-Chunk, sometimes referred to as Winnebago, although that's actually a corruption of an Ojibwe word. And his name was Jim Funmaker. He made it to 102. He was still driving at 102. And he'd get pulled over by the cops once in a while, and he'd tell the cop, "Boy, you look at my license. You see how old I am? I have to speed. I might die before I get there." And the cop would laugh and just let him go. There were folks contemporary that I knew and historical figures too, like the late Chief Buffalo, who was one of the preeminent chiefs in Wisconsin, Roger Jourdain from Red Lake. And these are guys who just made it into their 90s, which is considered a good run now, but not necessarily newsworthy. There are lots of other folks who made it well into their 100s. Newton Wind, who was also from Red Lake, he ended up being the Grand Marshal for the 4th of July parade in Bemidji in 1976, and he had lived through half of America's first 200 years. It's like, that was pretty cool. These guys, Gagigegijik from Warroad and John Smith from Leech Lake, each would have been the world record holder for human longevity had their birth records been authenticated in a colonial system. The formal record holder is actually this woman from France, who's quite remarkable herself, made it to 122. But both of Gagigegijik and John Smith would have eclipsed her record. That's pretty cool. They had to know something. This might sound like a strange place to start, but if you check out these books, which are non-Indigenous authored works, that are trying to answer the questions about how do you outlive? How do you have a remarkably long life? What does it take to be an outlier? You know, the Good Life is about the big longitudinal Harvard study about human happiness and longevity, where they're following generations in families and checking in with them every year for health checkups and interviews. And you get a very different perspective if you ask someone, what was the last 100 years like, that you do if you ask someone each year for 100 years in a row, what's going on. All of them speak to some remarkable things. So it's not just eat right and exercise, although do eat right and do exercise. But all of them in different ways speak to the importance of relational health, healthy relationships. And that can take many forms. It can be with a spouse, friend, child, children, community, friends, so many different iterations. But that healthy relationships pay huge dividends to longevity. In my view, these guys are starting to catch up to my guys, the elders that I was just showing you something about a minute ago. Because each, in their way, was directly connected to community, culture, ceremony, and if you think about it as human beings, until about 10,000 years ago, which in the span of time is not that long, all of us lived in villages. All of us had earth-based worldviews. All of us lived in community. All of us harvested food together and put it into a common food cache, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. We survived saber-toothed tigers and cave bears, not because we outcompeted the person in the next cave or accumulated more resources than them. We survived those things because the person in the next cave loved us. And they would intervene if we needed something. So as humans, it's literally in our DNA. We are hardwired to need connection, belonging, and love. And the Western world tells us to pursue individualism, competition, and materialism, and it has us at odds with our most fundamental needs and yearnings, and the things that contribute mightily to our best chances at a long, healthy, happy life. I don't know if you're familiar with Maslow, Abraham Maslow, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He kind of shared this one with the rest of the world. You've got basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, and there's kind of a tier, and at the very tippy top, you can do a pirouette around your individual self-actualization. What a lot of people don't realize was that Maslow, although he was trained as a psychologist, played anthropologist, and he actually got his information from a study of the Blackfeet. He left them as nameless informants, and he changed things. So for the Blackfeet's self-actualization, the healthy human part, starts at the base, and building up from there, you go to community-based actualization as an engine that feeds relational health and cultural perpetuity, so that even if something happened to somebody's primary relationship, caregiver, whatever, the cultural perpetuity and community health is enough to buoy that person for a good chance at a long, healthy, happy life. When you put those things next to each other, you can see what Maslow changed. And when you put it in context with all of the other things we've been learning, you can see that it may have been a disservice to change it in the ways that he did. Finally, the scientists are catching up with our elders. We do need healthy relationships and healthy communities. Where we're going with this is that we are in a diverse world. It is only going to be more diverse. We're on our way to 10 billion people on planet Earth, and then the human population begins to drop. We're only 20 years away from the British population being majority racial minorities. That's Great Britain. In the United States, the majority of the documented kids are people of color. That's who's here. It doesn't matter, Democrats, Republicans, build the wall, don't build the wall, be mean to everybody and try to throw them over a fence. Like, that is who is here. And if you want the people you care about to have a good chance at a long, healthy, happy life, and you understand that relational health is central to that, it means we better figure out how to get along. We better figure out how to show people what it looks like to heal, what it looks like to reconcile, instead of what it looks like to fight one another, to fight over just us, not them, as opposed to justice, and saying it's one thing and doing it's another. If you are focused on your individual self-actualization, it's easier to be in a just us frame of mind. But when you have a community-based frame, it is easier to think about the importance of reconciliation, healing. And we can see that we're really in the same canoe, so we should start paddling together so we can go somewhere. Part of the work is zooming out a little bit to get some perspective, and then zooming in so we can start paddling. That Indigenous folk have some remarkable examples and ongoing practices at relational health. It's what our ceremonial life is about. It's what our cultural practices are. In the middle, there's a picture of me tapping a maple tree with one of my daughters. We have a custom when a baby's born where we actually take the placenta and afterbirth out into the maple forest and we bury it by a maple tree, which is considered the tree of life. And when we go out in the spring to open our sugar bush, my kids and grandkids are out there, and I have both, and we are making offerings at the tree of life, and all the placentas for all my children and grandchildren are in the same grove of trees. And I feel so connected to the woods, and to the kids, and to the grandkids, and to my parents, and to my grandparents. And boy, cutting a tree down sure feels different. And so there's just an opportunity to do something that we all need to do. I've come to realize that happiness and health are not destinations that someday we get to, including health for a nation or the world. These are practices that we have to practice at. You put a ring on your finger, and it does not mean happily ever after, although you say that. It means I promise to practice at happily ever after with my person. And if we're honest, some days better than others. But if you keep practicing, you do become happier. It's the same with health. You can't get all your workouts in for your entire life in one trip to the gym. I'm like, got it all done, don't have to worry about that anymore. Right? You have to keep going. And you have to keep practicing. And if you do become healthier. And you do become stronger. And so I can't promise you like the perfect solution for all of the isms, but I can promise you that practice does get you closer to that goal. We do need to practice. We need to practice at healing. We need to practice at reconciling. We need to practice at happiness. We need to practice at relational health. And all of these things contribute. When you flash forward to today, you will notice that Native people are lagging in longevity data, right? This is the aggregated data, and I'm not going to take time to do a whole breakdown on everything wrong with how we collect data. I'll tell you a couple things, though. The 2010 census said there were 5 million of us. The 2020 census said there were 10 million of us. We didn't have that many babies that fast. Although I think I did my part. Hey. But they let you check more than one box. There are all kinds of school districts, programs, and municipalities going, we got way more natives than I ever thought we did. How can this be? What do we need to know? What do we need to do? It also means that a lot of the native population is especially multiracial, so they may not look the stereotypical part. Some are a full-blooded native person. They look super brown. Some look black. Some look white. Some look racially ambiguous. You can't tell. But people experience racial dynamics by color, but also by culture, and also by consciousness, how we see ourselves. When I think about, and this doesn't even tell you everything, that's everybody who self-identifies as Native. If you look at the enrolled tribal citizenry, or if you look by geography, you see some other even more stark and disturbing information, like a life expectancy at Pine Ridge for men of 48, and women 52. And they tell you to save money for retirement. The Native population is as complex as any other. How come this data doesn't jive with those elders I was showing you a couple minutes ago and what we know about relational health? And I think the answers are pretty obvious without taking a deep dive onto history lessons. There was not just genocide. There was not just diseases. There was an effort, and there is still an ongoing effort to disconnect people from the engines of their relational health. Residential boarding schools, this is Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who said, our goal is to kill the Indian in order to save the man. Schools that kept cemeteries for babies at Haskell, at Carlisle, at so many others. By the way, the US government could not build enough schools fast enough to enroll the 20,000 Native kids every year they were putting into the schools, so they subcontracted a lot of the work to churches who ran a significant percentage of the schools. And they did lots of damage. Even today, our educational system is still very colonial. When we talk about things like white privilege, we're not talking simply about things like financial advantage. But if you're a white kid in the United States of America, you will have the privilege of going to school and having your race widely represented in who does the teaching. A white kid will get a white teacher at some point. Your race will be widely represented in the stories that are taught, in the examples of what awesomeness looks like. I went to school, I never once had a Native teacher all the way through K-12, college, master's, up to my PhD. I had my first Indigenous educator. And that is the most common experience for Indigenous folks. what's going on in the school systems. 87% of educational standards that mention Native anything are stories from before 1900. We're reinforcing the narratives of erasure. 1 out of 3 Native kids has been adopted or fostered out of their family of origin. Until the Indian Child Welfare Act, 99% placed into white families. After the Indian Child Welfare Act, 74% placed into white families. I think someone would be upset if 1 out of 3 white kids was removed from their families and if most of them were placed into a totally not white home. Even if the fostering or adopting families are really kind and loving and had the best of intentions. All of this stuff is part of a pattern. Those are the things that put the schism that got us to this disconnect between what the data is showing you and what we could see, not just from anecdotal evidence, but a lot of other things about the importance of relational health. So I just wanted to lay that out. I won't spend a lot of time on my own biography, but I'll give you kind of a very quick Reader's Digest version. My father was not Native at all. He was actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He had 300 family members who were killed. He made it out of there after severe trauma experiences at the age of 13, made it to America at the age of 14, lied about his age, signed up for the US Army, and served in World War II at the age of 17, eventually made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mom grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. She was actually an enrolled member at White Earth, but her father was enrolled at Leech Lake, and that was their residence. And she has her own remarkable story dealing with pretty severe poverty. All the kids got pulled from school 8 weeks out of every year to help with food production, harvesting wild rice, fishing, hunting, maple production, all of that. There were 10,000 tribal members at Leech Lake, and she lived on the res for 18 years in a row, and she only met 1 professional Native person her entire childhood. So out of 10,000 people, they couldn't find one of us to be a banker, a police officer, or a teacher. And it wasn't because nobody wanted such a job, and it wasn't because no one could do such a job. It's because even in a Native space, the systems were that successful at centering whiteness and white folk to run the show. The one Native person she met, by the way, was the school nurse. And she thought, maybe I could do that. And so she ended up going to nursing school and then came back to work for the tribe's health program. And she thought, even here, Native people are getting pushed around. Enough of that. She went back to school and she ended up getting a law degree. She was the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. Go, Mom. When I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court and she'd say, you sit there and don't say anything. So I'd sit there and not say anything. And what I really remember is that she was the only woman in court. And that she and her law partner, Paul Day, were the only Natives in court. And I came walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. It's the D in the DEI. Diversity, representation, role models, and they do matter. In the absence of it, you get the all-male gender equity team. No matter how well-intentioned or how woke, you're missing some vital perspectives and the optics aren't so good. After the murder of George Floyd, there was a significant increase in the creation of DEI positions in the United States of America, mainly in the corporate world. Within 3 years, over half of the positions were eliminated. And today, 74% of the positions are held by white people. There are lots of ways to undermine the efforts. Paul Day, we just did his retirement party. They asked me to speak, and I had to say, you were the first Native man I ever saw doing something professional. But in the room were 300 Native American judges, lawyers, educators, and social workers. I said, look how far we've come. Think how much further we have to go and what one person can do. Here's a picture of me as a tyke. It is ironic in so many ways. Wearing a Washington Redskins t-shirt. And I'm usually telling people, don't do that. For Q&A, we can talk about why. But I remember this day, and there was a lot going on. My mom did her law degree in Washington, D.C. And there were a few years when we were going back and forth between D.C., and we always had our summers on the res. And, you know, my father was like restarting his life, and my mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty. So they were like dealing with things. I never had food scarcity. I was well provided for. But the house we started in did not have electricity or running water. Buy a gallon of milk, tie a string around that, sink it in the creek, which was spring-fed, kept it cool. In the morning, pull on the string, pop the top. It was nice and cool. Pour it on your Cheerios, away you go. I was brought from like being a native person to being the Indian in D.C. and back and forth in these different environments. And in first grade, I was the only native kid in my class. Everyone else was either white or black. And I was a great novelty because I was a boy with long hair. One day, I don't know what possessed her, the teacher decided to dress me up like a girl in front of class, put barrettes and makeup and the whole works. And they had a good laugh. Like, you would think someone would get fired for doing things like that. Maybe today, that would be a little more likely. Although I have heard today about native kids having their hair cut as a punishment at school and other things going on. Or, you know, that's not all the way behind us. But in any event, I also don't know what possessed me. Maybe because I come from a long line of ferocious warriors. But I never told my parents what happened. I just came home and I said, Ma, I want a haircut. And I got one. There I am, that 70s do. I toughed it out through first grade. Second grade, I actually had a black teacher, the only teacher of color I ever had in my journey. And it was such a relief. She treated me like a normal human being. She was left-handed. I tried to write lefty, even though I'm right-handed. Third grade, and from then on, always white teachers, and I kind of froze like a deer in the headlights. I was like, oh, here we go. And for a skinny little native kid, I put on the best stoic Indian. They'd say, what's your name? Says here, your name's Anton. What's your name? All right. Take it to the principal, you know, and I'd be down at the principal's office. What's your name, kid? Pretty soon they'd have me assessed with learning disabilities, behavior disabilities, all these different things. Makes you wonder about the assessments. And eventually they're like, we're going to have to send him to a special school. And I'm thinking, yes, I'm out of here. But I was also thinking about my mom, who could be kind of ferocious at times, and what she might do to me if I got kicked out of like third grade. And so they finally asked, do they speak other languages at home other than English? And I spoke. And I said, Dad speaks German, Mom speaks Ojibwe. And they're like, oh, that's the problem. Brought my parents in to this conference that I so wish would have been recorded. It was mainly school officials speaking very loudly and very slowly, as if a language problem were a volume problem. And then, I don't know, my mom said something snarky and snippy, like, I'm sorry, sir, could you distill the salient parts of your communication? That doesn't make any sense to us at all. You know, and they're like, they speak English. Was that English? I don't know. She also turned and gave me the native Mother Godzilla laser vision death stare. Started to speak. 3 years of behavior change off of one day. A lot of the kids have a day. It's not the same as my day, but a lot of them do. And it's like mercury in a fish. The microaggressions and the macro ones accumulate to the point where here we are in mixed company trying to get something done, and we don't always realize that the emotional trust bank account may start with a negative balance, and we haven't even opened our mouth yet or done anything wrong. And it's everybody. The schools are trying to figure it out. The churches are trying to figure it out. Everyone's trying to figure it out. There's no way to pretend the past didn't happen. We are the inheritors of a canvas that people have been painting on for thousands of years. If we had a blank canvas, we'd all paint a totally different picture. We can still paint on this canvas that's already been painted on for a couple thousand years, and what we paint can change things, but it cannot erase everything that's already been put there. Part of the work is coming to terms with our shared history and the complexities of that. For me, America has a beautiful foundational promise and has had many highly oppressive realities from then to now. For me, America saved my dad's life and tried to kill my mom. It's not just an evil thing, and it's not just a beautiful thing, although I think there are people who would want you to believe it's only either or. It is yes and. The stories of people coming to America to make a new, better, beautiful life came at the expense of other people who were here or who were brought here against their will to provide the land, the labor, and so many other things. You cannot remove the ugly stuff from the beautiful stuff. It's all on the canvas. And you can't cover up the ugly stuff and say it never happened. We need to reconcile those things and come to terms with it. The efforts today to purge federal websites and educational material and tell people what to teach and what not to teach, that won't change the truth. And truth and reconciliation begins with truth. There's no way around that. An uncomfortable array of truths. By the way, the other thing going on in this picture that's a little harder to tell is that, I just had a haircut. I'd been through this experience, but deep down inside, I still knew that being Anishinaabe, being Native, was a good thing. And all I could find was an old Washington Redskins t-shirt, so I put it on. Sometimes we deal with hypervisibility, like the long hair and getting picked on for that, and sometimes we deal with invisibility. And I did want to be seen for who I was. I've got this bandana on, and that was a cape because I was super Native. I made it all the way through high school with a plan that a lot of high schoolers come up with. I'm going to get out of town and never come back. Made it through college with a plan to come home and never leave. And in the long run, that is what I did. This is Archie Mose, who was on one of the early slides, and I ended up living with him. I got a real immersive experience with our language and culture. It was transformative for me and set me on a path. And I've been trying and working and striving to teach this language to my own children, to my community, and to build tools to help us scale that up. All right, skipping a couple of these. One of the granddaughters, one of my sons, they're actually doing the maple harvest there. Some of my crew, we have 9 kids, and if you like kids, let me know. A lot of them are grown up, and some of them are married, and they've got kids of their own, so we got 5 grands. I think we are enculturated to think of people finding a way through bad things as individual exemplars of resiliency, as opposed to the beneficiaries of healthy environments or remarkable opportunities. I was the beneficiary of incredible privilege. I had 2 parents who loved me, who provided examples to me of triumph through adversity. That was their lift, not mine. I actually believed I could do things, including get food out of a tree, because of the childhood that I had, that a lot of people do not get. I was an American, and today, I bet nobody in this room starved. But there are a lot of people going hungry today. And it's not their bad morals, lack of a work ethic, or anything like that. It's because they're living in a different part of the world. I was in that environment. I was in a place where while there were some people who wanted to hold me back, push me down, or deny me opportunity, and I have many examples of that, I also had genuine chances to stretch my legs and to try to do things. And I did find ways to make things happen. On so many levels, I received so much privilege. The Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, they suffered plenty. They were, when they started the allotment policies, individual parcels of land to individual people, the folks there could only get allotments in white earth. if they moved to White Earth and abandoned their original homelands. And that was the case from the beginning of the allotment policy in 1889 until 1926, when they had the first opportunity for people in Mille Lacs to get a 5-acre homestead. Until then, they were landless in their own land. At the same time that there was this, and by the way, in 1901, the local sheriff in Isle burned down all of the native homes and wigwams and said, "You are homeless, go to White Earth." There were all kinds of horrible things that happened, but they stayed. At the same time that there was all this stuff pushing them down and keeping them down, there's the fact that native nations have this thing that other minoritized racial groups in America don't have, which is a sovereignty that predated the United States of America, has existed through all of its years and continues to exist to this day. And in that unique environment, although I wouldn't say Mille Lacs is only a privileged people, they did have this benefit of their tribal sovereignty, which meant that if a state like Minnesota says gaming and gambling is illegal except for pull tabs, Powerball, and church bingo, then that law does not apply to a native nation, and they built casinos. They saved half their money from the first dollar they made at the casino. Today, the endowment is over $1 billion. It's bigger than the Bush Foundation. And it produces more money than the casinos. And they have a diversified business plan. Why are we sending our money to a non-native bank? They bought the bank. They have a diversified business plan. They bought the Intercontinental Hotel, St. Paul Riverfront on Kellogg. They bought the DoubleTree in downtown St. Paul. They bought the DoubleTree, St. Louis Park. And so they have been thoughtful about the use of their funds. I came to a meeting, this was a couple years before the pandemic, and they said, "We would like to reimagine workforce development in Mille Lacs instead of just applying for grants and trying to teach people to be a good gas station attendant. We do need those too, but we want to train people for the jobs of tomorrow, to be able to publish books and develop curriculum and be teachers in our schools and to use modern technology and be videographers and all these things." And we've identified only 25 remaining fluent first speakers of the Ojibwe language in our communities in Mille Lacs. Most of them are right there in that picture, the Jedi Council. And they were asking me, because of my long experience working in Ojibwe language revitalization, you got some ideas for us. And I said, well, you're not going to send all your elders back to college, get them teaching degrees, and come run a new school or program. We have to do something else. So how about this? Let's develop Rosetta Stone for the language. Let's develop a literacy initiative and do books in the tribal language, and through the process, teach people all of these different types of jobs. They looked at my list of stuff and they said, well, let's do all of it. And there's more to the mechanics and the contracts and other things. Brad Harrington's in the room somewhere. He ended up working on books with us. And there are many, many people who are involved in this. A team of 50 working on the books. I saw Kent Whitworth here. The Minnesota Historical Society Press agreed to publish the books, even though no one on their staff could read them. That was a big vote of faith in the quality of the work. It was pretty cool. Talk about relational health. We had lots of elders. There's Brenda Moose, and behind is Lee Staples. We had students working with. There's Hannah Ori. She was starting out as a student of the language. Now she's actually working at Lekudere Ojibwe University teaching the language. There's a white linguist kind of cut off on the left side there, John Nichols, who worked on the Ojibwe People's Dictionary. We had all kinds of folks and all kinds of books. Here's Elfrida opening up her package, realizing that she's a published author, and she was crying happy tears. And Rosetta Stone too, which is so cool, pushes to an app on your phone or your computer. And we had to teach elders how to work through the pandemic, which sometimes was pretty fun. We had to send a computer and a grandchild to everybody's house. And a lot of things went sideways. I called one of the elders here. I'll put the Jedi Council up again for a sec. And one of the Lals, little old ladies in the middle of the pile there, Carol, And I called her up. Asin gadano kimin. I said, it's time for our work session. Oh, tagi jwago shingi wanenda naja ambizi kan babizi kawaga natage bagamigo indija. She goes, I said, it's time for our work session. She said, well, I forgot. I got my coat on. I'm going to the casino. I said, casino? There's a pandemic. You're supposed to stay home and be safe. And she said, well, you know, the language is more important. Let's work. So she takes her coat off, and we work for about 3 hours by Zoom. And then she goes, well, I'm putting my coat on and going to the casino now. My niece has been waiting in the car the whole time. Middle of the winter, engine running, also never came in to check and see what's going on. Yeah. But that's how they were, dedicated, just drop everything. And the pandemic was no joke. 6 of the fluent speakers passed away. That was 20% of their fluent speakers in Mille Lacs. Joe Naquinabe, who's on the left side there with the buzz cut, revered ceremonial drum chief, he had lost a brother and a sister. When we finally came out of the pandemic and we finally were able to celebrate the books and the Rosetta Stone and things like that, Joe spoke, and he kind of floored me when he said, you know, we've been through a lot. We've been through a lot the past few years. And we've been through a lot the past few hundred years. But seeing all of these young people coming around, seeing what we have been able to build, knowing that our elders will be teaching people our language for hundreds of years to come, I have to say that this has been the happiest time of my life. So there are thousands of ways to work with nonprofits, with tribes, with community in a grassroots way, with state and even federal institutions to do things that provide engines that, among other things, create opportunity for relational health. And by the way, the next generation of people who were part of this project, they have been stepping into language leadership, political leadership, economic positions, all kinds of things. It has had reverberating impacts. And by the way, the Mille Lacs tribal government can say we hire lots of people, native and non-native. We expect everybody to get to this level of fluency in our tribal language, because working in our communities is a privilege. Here's the tool to do it. The assessments are built right in. You have 1 year from date of hire. Welcome to our native nation. So language revitalization is not just about another pretty bird singing in the forest. It's about sovereignty. It's about health. It's about so many things. I love this Abigail Echohawk quote. She said, "We are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient." In other words, we are deeply well served by our ancestors, by our communities, and by one another. We need to remember that, because we can build on and grow the positives, and that does take us somewhere. You familiar with trauma, historical trauma, how that works? I don't really want to talk about the mechanics of that so much, but as part of healing, coming to terms with it can be helpful. When somebody experiences a trauma, it can cause great damage, even excessive levels of prolonged stress. We've been learning now that, this happens with all sentient life, from the monarch butterflies, which go on epic 3,000-mile-long voyages with multiple metamorphoses. It's not learned behavior. Something happens in the DNA, but it's really part of the epigenetic carriage that goes on top of the DNA. It's the environmental stimulus that still gets passed forward over time. Same with the sea turtles that know to go out to sea rather than upland. There's lots in the science around this too. Keep that in the back of your head for 1 second. When somebody experiences a trauma, especially as a child, the natural fight, flight, and freeze type responses are harder to activate because they are small. If they fight, They're outmatched. If they flight, someone's going to bring them back. If you think about the human brain, like this is our fight, flight, freeze stuff, wrapped around it, your wise owl prefrontal cortex, the newest part of the human brain. And when you get a stress or trauma stimulus, boom, this goes offline. Deer jumps in front of the car, this has to go offline. Step on the brake, saves your life. Someone's coming in, ready to hurt you, this goes offline, run. So you need it to be able to do that. If you have 5 adverse childhood experiences, this happens so much, it replumbs your brain and stuff starts to happen. A little bit of stress is okay. That's the kind that says, I'm going to get up, roll out of bed, and give her a go today. Prolonged stress can be tolerable, although not ideal. That's the kind that says, I'm going to grind this out and finish up my college degree. But overwhelming stress or trauma cause great damage. And it happens in predictable ways. Hyperarousal, which is angry, agitated, emotionally reactive. That is the fight response. And the exact opposite, hypoarousal, which is spaced out, zoned out, disengaged. The hyperarousal is, hey, Johnny, come on in. It's time for your test today. What you coming at me like that for? Throw the chair. Or the hypoarousal, hey, Johnny, come on in. It's time for your test. Huh? Gabor Mate and other researchers have found links between trauma and ADHD and between trauma and addiction. And the reasons are, it doesn't have to be your trauma. It can be that of a parent or grandparent. By the way, all of us human beings have trauma in our tree. You go far enough back, everyone's clunking someone over the head with a club. However, some groups, you think about the black experience with the transatlantic slave trade. You think about the native experience with genocide, boarding schools, things like this. There are periods of intense trauma when this is just going. And so today it doesn't just pop up, as it does with any of us, in unexplained depression or self-destructive behavior. It can happen to anybody. But it pops up in some groups like popcorn. And there's just more to deal with. It's why looking at not just the governmental systems, but the systemic nature throughout history of advantaging and disadvantaging certain groups by race and all kinds of other things have cascading effects to this day. The rats, when you put the electrode into the pain center of the brain and give them a pain stimulus at the same time that you introduce the smell of apple blossoms, not only will that rat be scared of apple blossoms the rest of its life, but the children and grandchildren of that rat with no pain stimulus will also be scared of apple blossoms. It's not just genetics, otherwise all rats would always be scared of apple blossom smells. It is epigenetics. It comes from an environmental stimulus, but it still goes forward through time. And there are lots of questions. We got more questions than answers. Think about Native people being chased around in the 1800s by soldiers with blue uniforms and guns. And today we police them with people with blue uniforms and guns. And then we wonder, why are some of these folks emotionally reactive and agitated in a routine traffic stop instead of calmly responsive? Well, we should experiment with the things, including even something as simple as a different colored uniform or whatever. I'm not saying that that'll fix all the big things, but to create safer space so we can move forward. ADHD is hyperarousal to hypoarousal, right? Periods of intense hyperfocus and then spaced out, lost in my TikTok feed. By the way, plenty of trauma in my family tree. Father was a Holocaust survivor, mother went through a lot. I'm doing great. I'm doing all right. And I do have some stuff to navigate, you know. My wife's like, we're signing the kid up for softball. Equipment package, $500. What? There's emotionally reactive hyperarousal. I know enough to try to catch myself, don't always do a great job. We co-regulate relational health. And so it's like, baby, it's me here. Okay, time out. Okay, of course the kid can do softball. But dang, can we find some that played against sports? Because, okay. And I'm totally lost in my TikTok feed. Barely made it here today. So that's the ADHD piece and the addiction piece. When people have been through a lot of trauma, they desperately crave safety. They know logically and objectively that using and boozing is not going to make them safer. But while under the influence, can numb out just for a bit so you don't have to feel so unsafe. It's not bad people, not that it's a recommended pathway. And so seeing the humanity of what did you go through? Somebody in addiction, like let's say alcohol addiction, can heal to the point where they can walk into a bar and order a burger and not fall off the wagon. Especially if they are connected. Connected maybe to the person walking into the bar with them, or to their higher power, or to their cultural practice, or their community, or even the person working at the bar. So we need to tend to safety. And safety, I love what Gabor Mate has to say. Safety is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. Safety is not the absence of threat, but the presence of connection. And what is connection? And it's so many things. It could be engaging with your indigenous language revitalization community or ceremony. It could be something in your own faith community, your family. There's no one size fits all. But fostering healthy connection, the relational health, is critical. Let's face it, colonization has been hard. Take one language, one culture, one religion. There's only one way and one group of people who can teach it to the rest of the world. It's been about erasure. And it's used so much violence. But when you solve your problems with violence, you make a lot of other problems. Now, why would we think that all the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems could be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? And they can't. They cannot. And Native people have, and to me, like our ceremonies are many things, but among the things that they are is a community of practice. We practice praying for other people, not just yourself. We practice feasting, which is not just about the food. We practice taking our sacred time, which we guard religiously so we can squander on our TikTok feed, and devoting some of your sacred time to the betterment of others as a practice. Practicing that it's not all about me, which is a healthy practice. This is Elias. So I mentioned that we have a big family, 9 kids. I didn't mention that we have a big, beautiful blended family, his, theirs, and somebody else's kids. I was married previously, and my ex-wife had a terrible stumble into the darkness. The kind that, although sometimes we experience shame even talking about it, and to me it took me a while to be able to talk about it, the kind that affects all of us. She got into drugs, spent most of the past 20 years unhoused, currently incarcerated. We tried everything we could to get through and to save her and to help her, and none of it worked. And so this kid was an infant in arms when she fell, which meant that he was the recipient of the kind of blessings and curses only a father can bestow. No memory of being held by his mom. The number one job as a parent is do not mess your kids up, but you don't get any do-overs. So here too, I relied on so many things. I relied on our whole village and our ceremonies. We had ceremonies to bless our new house and put a little feather on the southwest corner. I said, this will keep us safe even when it's storming out. Sometimes it would start storming. He'd run outside, do a lap around the house, come in soaking wet. And I was like, what are you doing, kid? And he's like, I'm just checking on the feather. And it seemed to reassure him. And we have another ceremony we call a bear smoke, where we build a miniature wigwam. We put little offerings in there for each member of the family. And he'd be running around playing in the woods, then he'd look at that, then he'd smile, and he'd be all right. My dad was my next door neighbor, and so like he spent every morning with my dad, who, I don't know, my dad was kind of tough, but he was really softening up in the last years of his life, and so he'd punish the kid with cookies and, dote on him every morning when he's getting ready for the school bus. They were super close. I just had so much help. And I was at one point at 7 children, single parenting. Yeah, completely overwhelmed. The kids have lots of stories if I give them the mic. We didn't go out to eat a lot. We're worried about money and things like that. But when we did, it had to be a buffet for instant gratification. And I'd say just put us in the back, as far away from normal humans as possible. Twice, restaurants burst into applause when we left. True stories. And there was always stuff, like the kid one time looks over and like fills his shorts looking at the table next to us, and like they just dropped their silverware and walked, There are so many things. One time I'm trying to get his coat on him, and he couldn't get his fists through the coat, and I'm like, baby, what's in your hands? He's like, oh, I got the mac and cheese. And he's like smuggling 2 cents worth of mac out of the buffet. And I'm like, why are my kids the resiest kids on the res? Like, come on. Of course, I'm like a little anxious, and so I'm thinking, oh no. Is it like his mom can be taken, so anything can be taken? Now he's hiding candy bars between the mattresses, or what? By middle school, it became pretty clear that he was a super outgoing kid. Loved to sing. He would have loved our start. And he got into show choir, which is kind of like Glee Club. You ever see that show, Glee? I had to watch every single episode of Glee with the kids. And for me, like, there's so much drama. Like, just skip to the songs. The songs are cool. And I was teasing him. And I said, like that show, all the drama, whoever's dating at the start of the school year, they'll all switch by the end of the school year. There's going to be a lot of crying, a lot of hugging, a big trophy. Shut up, Dad, you don't know. I was like, okay. And I had to miss his first out-of-town meet, 9th grade. And I said, I don't care if it's midnight, 1 a.m., you call me. So he calls, and I wish I could have recorded it, because it started with, Dad, I love you. I'm like, I love you too, son. How's it going? I got a dozen spontaneous I love yous from a teenage boy, right? And it's like, Dad, I love you. We won. I love you. Everybody's crying. I love you. They're all hugging each other. It's a big trophy. I'm like, I told you. And so like things are going good. And then the pandemic hits, and it's like show choir's canceled, girlfriend's canceled, prom is canceled, blah. And all kids do have to break from their parents. It's normal, healthy, has to happen. It's tough losing influence over your kid, even though it's normal that they do this. But it's also hard, like the girls would often go through this 13 or 14 because they mature a little earlier, and the boys, it's a little later, like right at the time when it's time to like figure out what comes next. I had to push him a little bit. I said, son, there are 1,000 definitions of success. You do not have to pick anything that I come up with. You have to pick something that you come up with, because something is going to happen next. There are no breaks from life. You got one brother who went for a union construction job. You got siblings who went to college. You can do those things or any number of other things. My job is to support you. If you want some coaching, I'm in, but that's not even a requirement. What you going to do? So he's moping around for a while, and finally he said, okay, college. I was like, college sounds great. What are you thinking? He's like, well, I was looking at all these different schools, and of those Ivy League schools, Dartmouth is the one that has some decent native programs. And part of me's thinking, how do we pay for that? Part of me's thinking only 7% of the people who apply get in. But my job is not to close doors in his face. My job is to support. I said, I think you should go for it. In his application process, he had to write essays, and he ended up deciding to write about our family. My dad, who he's quite close to, my grandma, who had gone to a residential boarding school, his mom, times when he was mad or sad, and a lot of the time when he couldn't feel anything at all, except a little guilty because he couldn't feel anything at all. And then he said some of the most profound things I've heard from a teenager. He said, "We are more than the sum of our tragedies, and all that trauma stops with me." Took us a little bit, and we got this.
Let's go! Oh, I'm so happy for you. Oh, my boy. I didn't think I was going to make it. Oh, I made Let's go! Come here, Evan!
For us, this was about more than a kid getting into the school of his dreams. I think I was worried, would he deny himself opportunity for the sake of familiarity? There he is, out into the snow. Yeah. Or would he self-sabotage on his way out the door? Would the epigenetic imprint from so many lanes in our family trip him up somehow? And people said things like, you know, you saved those kids and you pulled them out of the darkness, and it never felt quite right. That every time he was finding a way to run around the house and look at that feather, or look at the bear smoke, or sing through it all, he was restoring my faith in the decency of human beings and our resiliency and our ability to overcome. That I did not save him, but he sure saved me. With all of these things, I've learned that it is a reciprocal process. The receiving is in the giving. That when it comes to racial reconciliation, it's not an act of charity for the poor and disenfranchised, but we all need healing. If you've come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together. That the process is transformational for everyone. This is what Paulo Freire calls the dialogic between oppressor and oppressed. That there's never been a time when the oppressor has just liberated the oppressed. There's always been a conversation, and it's often been uncomfortable. But the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, and if there is any reaction, both are transformed. This will transform us all. It's not just that all of our grandchildren are going to be busy falling in love with one another and making babies, and, although that is happening. We have to orchestrate this ourselves. There's lots in the way for everybody. I think a lot of white folk are afraid of exposing an ignorance, afraid of offending someone, afraid of getting beat up around the ears for the sins of one's ancestors. And the fear keeps you immobilized. The cultural conditioning is to delegate it. Send an email to Jim Baird Jacobs and hopefully he'll take care of it. It's kind of like you've been skipping leg day for life. And now we're saying we want you to come to the gym and do squats. And it doesn't sound good. It sounds terrifying, especially your first day doing leg day in front of all these people. So the message is, be brave. Don't skip the gym. If you have someone else do all your workouts for you, guess what happens? You atrophy, they get stronger, and you feel out of your depth for generation upon generation. Come to the gym. I will spot you. And the funniest thing happens when you start coming to the gym, and by the way, I cannot promise it'll feel great. Sometimes it feels not great. 330 million people in America, someone will go sideways sometimes. hold space, be patient and understanding of their humanity, and come to the gym anyways. Because if you keep coming to the gym, you acclimate to that and the workout starts to feel good. You're going to want more workout. You're going to want more weight stacked on a bar. You will get stronger and you will be ready to do your part of the lift. And for everybody else, you're all hulked out because you're the only one who's been going to the gym trying to make things happen, and they are angry. They're so angry at how unfair it is. They're so frustrated and exhausted from the continual effort. Do I really have to explain it again? Do I really have to wait patiently again when I don't get to live as long? How reasonable is that request? And so the message there is, explain it again. Come to the gym. Not just for your own workout regimen, but to spot others too. That doesn't mean you're going to do their workout for them. They got to do their own lift. But the only way through this stuff is together. That's what relational healing is about. That's what reconciling is about. And it's not a zero-sum game out there. Any more than women getting the right to vote would take away all of the power from men, or women entering the workforce would take all the jobs away from men. It actually grew the pie. If I get to do better, it will not be at someone else's expense. If I find my longevity, it will not take someone else's away. Even if my house value goes up, guess what? My neighbor's does too. If my kids are doing well and learning better, faster, smarter, then the teacher can work faster with everybody's kids. As the late, great Paul Wellstone said, we all do better when we all do better. I went with my father on his first trip back to Austria after World War II, and that happened in 1986. He spoke beautiful German his entire life, and when he stepped off the plane into the German-speaking world, he had a total meltdown, crying jag, freaked out, deeply triggered. We went around like Austria didn't get bombed to smithereens the way everybody else did. So like the house he lived in, my grandpa's store, all this stuff was still there. All given for free to Aryans who still owned it. We went to Dachau, we went to Mauthausen. And man, I was mainly thinking, not super proud of it, Germans and Austrians equals bad people. I was in judgment. I didn't go back again till 2022. Took my entire crew of kids. Here's the Karl Marxhof. My grandfather took this over in protest to the fascist takeover in Austria 4 years before the Nazi Anschluss. The Volksschule, where my dad went to school, the apartment my father grew up in, my grandpa's store, Hallstatt Lakes, where my family used to vacation. Of course, it's all my brown native kids swimming in the freezing waters. We went to Mauthausen concentration camp, the first one, and Dachau. We met up with some friends who had lived, they were Austrian academics who'd lived in the US for a couple of years and spent a lot of time with my dad recording his Holocaust reminiscences. They took us hiking in the Austrian Alps. Super kind, loved their laugh. One night we're having a visit, and they said, you know, pretty much everyone in Austria has at least one grandparent who was a Nazi. For us, all of our grandparents were Nazis. And the man, Thomas, he said, my paternal grandparents were unrepentant Nazis. Thought they did nothing wrong, would do it all over again. He said, I'm glad none of their grandkids think the same way. But at this point in time, we're like literally staying in their house. It was a little harder to look at Austrians and Germans and think, that means bad people. It became a little bit easier to see the beauty, not only of that landscape, but the German language, that culture, and the people whose house we were sharing, and at the same time see everything they did to our family and so many others. It may be a relief to the Austrians to know I'm not hating so bad. But the biggest relief was to me, not to carry so much heavy weight from the burdensome anger and judgment, clouding my disposition and immobilizing me from moving into action. through that experience, I think I found a little bit of healing. And that too can be passed forward as an epigenetic imprint, as well as a shared experience with my entire family. I believe deeply in the work that all of you are engaged in. And thank you so much for showing up today. My mom had a good line. She said, "Nothing can stop a Native person who knows who they are." All of her kids are doing just fine. And so I think about this little guy, my wounded inner child. I carry him with me everywhere I go. I had to learn to put him in the back seat, buckled up in his car seat, rather than give him the steering wheel all the time. That's a lifelong learning process. But at the same time, he knew that there was something beautiful about who I was. And I love him for that. He had a wisdom beyond his years at that point in time. And so I want to treasure that and grow and amplify that. There's our family property. If you like Shrek, that's my swamp. It didn't look like this when my dad was getting started. He acquired this farm and it looked like this. That's him on the tractor with my brother. Started planting trees. They planted over 1 million trees. Of course, they had a child labor force. I get to look at this forest every day, and it fills me with hope. We don't need to take this big mountain of problems humans have been making for thousands of years and move it right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can change everything. That's the work. Every conversation, every imperfect practice at healing, humanizing, and happiness. Every relationship formed and every community of practice delivers the goods. You're not a lone tree standing out there battered in this political climate. You're in a forest, a towering forest of trees to nurture and grow and steward for the generations to come. We have so much to learn from one another. Thanks for coming out tonight. Chimigwech. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.